He flew for the Japanese airline, the domestic one. He's going to talk about it. And I hope he talks about that beautiful Japanese woman that he married. Let's get him up here and find out. Lumar.
Go to bed.
Start now?
Sure is nice to have friends to introduce me. To set the mood, I want to dig out something here.
Where'd you borrow that?
Wow. And it has a name tag, Vince, but it's in Japanese.
Was that from a pawn shop, from a furloughed pilot? Good whip. Got it from the Dragon Lady.
You know, in the spring of 1970, I was preparing to retire after 22 years in the Air Force when I met a World Airways captain in Kadena, Okinawa. And I asked him if World was hiring any pilots. He said that he didn't know, but if I was interested in a flying job, I should contact IASCO, the International Air Service Company in California, since they hire foreign pilots. But he said, before I do, be sure that I have an ATP and a current Class 1 medical, which I didn't. So when I got back to Dover, I drove up to Baltimore, passed the written test, took the Class 1, and then being chief pilot of the Air Force, I scheduled myself for a 4-hour flight and invited an FAA inspector to give me a ATP check ride. The next day, the wing commander called me, full colonel, and he chewed my ass out for having an FAA inspector in the airplane. After I listened to him for a while, I told him, I said, Colonel, I agree with you totally, and I'll never do it again. It took him a while to figure out whether I was a wise ass or actually being a serious officer. Anyway, I had all the right squares to fill in the application, so I sent it to IASCO. And in November 1970, I received a phone call, wanted to know if I was interested in interviewing for a position flying for Japan Airlines at YS-11. He said they're interviewing 30 pilots for 15 slots. I said that I was, and in November 1970, I was interviewed by the chief pilot of Japan Airlines and Chuck Webben, who was the vice president of IASCO. In the interview, which is pretty standard, they asked me if I knew anything about a YS-11. I did a little research and I said, sure, I know about the YS-11. It's built by Nihon, 187 aircraft, is flown by Japan Airlines, all Nippon, Piedmont Airlines, has Rolls-Royce engines, Dodi-Roto props, 64 passengers and cruises at 300 miles per hour. They looked at me kind of surprised, but I was just answering the question. They said if I was selected for the job, it would pay $33,000 per year. This was in 1970. That'd be equivalent to about $190,000 a year today. Later that month, I was informed that I was selected and that YS-11 training would be with Piedmont Airlines in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. They said that the training would consist of 2 weeks of ground school and 7 hours of flight training, since they didn't have a simulator. In December 1970, 15 pilots ranging in age from 41 to 49, I was next to youngest at the time, began training with Piedmont Airlines. During the ground school, I was told to call IASCO, and the vice president wanted to know if I was interested in being designated chief pilot for the YS-11 fleet. This is kind of a surprise to me, but he said it would pay $500 more a month if I selected the position. He said if I accepted it, they'd explain my Pacific duties later when we met in California. I asked him, I said, that sounds great, but I hate to tell my fellow colleagues that I'm selected, so I'd like to have a ground instructor do it. So the next day, a Piedmont ground instructor announced to the rest of the crew that Lou Martin had been selected as chief pilot. They all looked at me and chins dropped. A lot of questions at the bar in the hotel later. After completing ground school, Bob Ammon, who flew KC-135s in the Air Force, he was to be my training partner. We reported in a Japan Airlines station in Norfolk, Virginia. That was on January 4th, 1971, for flight training. Our instructor told us that the training flights would be from 2 a.m. to 5 a.m. with a 1 o'clock briefing every day. On January 9th at 4 a.m., I received an FAA flight check and was issued a US YS-11 type rating. In January 1971, 15 pilots checked in at the Marriott Hotel in Burlingame, California for an IASCO briefing and obtaining a Japanese visa and a Class 1 physical, which surprisingly included an electroencephalograph. First time I've gone through this. And the nurse conducting my brain scan said that I should not clutter my brain with problems. So I imagined that I was a Secret Service agent on duty in Colombia, South America, and passed the exam with ease. I later had lunch with the IASCO Vice President, who told me that my main job as chief pilot would be to ensure good working relationships between the American pilots and the Japanese crew, which at times, he says, due to the cultural diversity, would be very difficult. One thing that made it difficult, Japan Airlines, this is the first time that they'd hired foreign pilots. He also told me about the problems, you'll hear these names later, of two captains, Jack Spence and Dick Emery, who had problems during the training at Piedmont. Contract was for 7 hours. After 7 hours, they weren't recommended for a check. The Japanese gave them 3 more hours, making it 10. After 10 hours, they still weren't recommended. They gave them 2 more hours. They had 12 hours, and the rest had 7. I then asked Mr. Wendman, who was the vice president, why I was selected as chief pilot, since I was next to the youngest of the group. He kind of chuckled. He said, well, Lou, he said, you had almost 5,000 hours of turboprop time. You were stationed in Misawa, Japan for 3 years with the Air Force. You have a college degree, and you're too young to fought against the Japanese during World War II. And you were the only one that knew anything about a YS-11. After a short stay in California, we were on a JAL DC-8 flight to Tokyo. After arriving, we were taken by bus to a hotel in Yokohama and given 5 days off to find a place to live. We were then required to complete 2 weeks of ground school with the Japanese. So I have to become familiarized with our airline duties and qualify for a commercial pilot's license, which was required so we could fly in the jump seat. During the period, we were also measured for uniforms, given a complete set. I still have this one. It does fit, a little tight. You notice that there's the name tag in Japanese. In March '71, the Japanese chief pilot requested that I and 3 other captains proceed to their training base near Osaka for a quick checkout. 5 days later, we were ready for our JCAB, Japanese Civil Aviation Board check rides, and told that when the government examiners, the high government examiners, entered the room, we must all rise and present a slight bow before being introduced. We passed our checks and were issued Japanese ATPs with the YS-11 type rating. After flying 25 hours of IOE with a Japanese instructor, I was scheduled for a line check by Mr. Matsushima, JCAB inspector. He had worked with the FAA for a couple of years, so he spoke excellent English. check ride was from Tokyo to an airport up in Hokkaido, which was a standard NDB approach, then back to Tokyo for about a 3-hour flight. After a level off, the flight attendant brought up 3 old bento box lunches, which they were surprised that I could eat with chopsticks. We're about 15,000 feet in clear air, nice smooth air. And I looked back, and Mr. Matsushima, after eating the lunch, was sound asleep in the jump seat. Approaching Tokyo, I tuned in AFHS, and they sent their radar vectors to a visual final. I looked back, and Mr. Matsushima was still sleeping. During our descent, I pulled the power back very slightly. I didn't want to disturb him from something that he had learned from the FAA in the United States, sleeping during a check ride. Finally, we got down to about 3,000 feet, told to contact the tower. The tower said, "Do you have the runway in sight?" We said, "Yes." So I said, "Approach flaps, gear down." The slump of the gear woke up Mr. Matsushima. And he and my co-pilot, who was the chief pilot, flying co-pilot for me for that flight, started jabbering in Japanese, and I was making a visual approach. About 3,000 feet or 10 miles out, Mr. Captain Ogle put a map in the windshield. I leveled off slightly, and I said, "What the hell's going on?" He says, "Mr. Matsushima, need ILS for check ride." I said, "I can't shoot an ILS, we're in a visual final." He said, "Mr. Matsushima, need check ride." I was really pissed off about that point. I picked up the map, threw it to the floor, and went to full flaps and completed the landing. Not a word was said in the cockpit. When we taxied into our gate, I turned to Mr. Matsushima and I said, "Mr. Matsushima, if you want to follow FAA rules and sleep during a check ride, that's your business. But I was responsible for 64 passengers, and I resent somebody putting a map in the window when I'm on short final." He said, "Check ride complete." So I knew enough to shut up. On April 1971, I was the first foreign captain to make a solo flight with a regular co-pilot. I think the Japanese had their fingers crossed, hoping that I would not crash and burn. As the rest of the foreign captains began flying the line, the Japanese chief pilot told me that he was receiving reports from his co-pilots and flight attendants that working with foreign pilots was difficult. He said that a few had stated that they did not want to fly with foreign captains, as they were afraid of making a mistake. He requested that I see what I could do to correct the problem. Based on this, I sent a letter of apology, which is standard in Japan, to Captain Ogle, who was the chief pilot, hoping to smooth the waters. The letter was intended for his eyes only, but Captain Ogle, unbeknownst to me, made copies of it and posted them on every bulletin board in the JDA environment. This really pissed off the other American captains. Some of the complaints as chief pilot that I had to contend with were, I'm just listing a few, hitting the co-pilot's hand with a pencil, criticizing them openly, making fun of their English, unhappy that the Japanese co-pilots were required to submit a report on our performance after each flight, an alcoholic possessed pilot not showing up for flights, a foreign pilot setting up for a landing on a river he thought was a runway. Got down to 200 feet before he realized the mistake, scared the hell out of the co-pilot. Insulting limousine drivers, I can tell you about this later if we have time. Bob lets me. Demanding first-class tickets. Demanding first-class tickets on their annual pass with JAL. Unhappy with IASCO collecting 15% of our salary. Captain missing radio calls. This is Dick Emery. I was requested to fly with him for 10 hours by the Japanese to see if he did have a hearing problem. He did, and he got all pissed off at me because I reported the truth to the Japanese. And there was complaints about having to sleep on a futon. You know what a futon is, kind of a mattress. Complaining about sleeping in a futon in a remote overnight station, which the Japanese just love. Japanese-style in-flight lunches, they were unhappy with those. And a captain trying to convert co-pilots to Christianity in a land with 1% of Christians. This was Captain Bob Fraser. Bob, on one of his flights, they had the weather hold, and he was trying to convert the Japanese co-pilot into Christianity, and the co-pilot pointed to, he said he was a Shinto, his Shintoism was his religion. Bob, trying to convince him that Shintoism was a heathen religion, he reached in his flight bag, pulled out a Phillips screwdriver, removed a wooden plaque that indicated Shintoism, and he pulled out a jackknife out of his bag and he started whittling on it. He said, see, nothing happens to me. It's a heathen object. The co-pilot was incensed, and the next day we had to report in front of the chief pilot while he apologized. During this period of time, the Japanese chief pilot requested that I and 2 other captains meet with the president of the Japanese Pilots Union. We did in uniform. This Japanese captain, maybe in his late 30s with 2 assistants, obviously had practiced his speech before we met. And he said, basically, he says, Captain Martin, I want you to know, when my company said they're going to hire foreign captains, 100% Japanese said, no, no, no. But the company explained it's necessary to upgrade to DC-9, so we said we'd hire foreign captains for a 2-year contract. He said, any questions? I said, no, thanks for the team. In June 1971, I received an anonymous phone call informing me that the foreign captains were holding a secret meeting in the Yokohama Navy Officers Club for the purpose of electing a new chief pilot. I checked the flight schedule, and sure enough, all the foreign captains except me were off the next day. And I was scheduled for a quick turnaround up to an airport called Hanamaki. I'd be back in Tokyo around 1. When I returned from my flight, I went next door to the Tokyo IASCO office to see Captain Jim Jack, a hell of a nice guy. He was the president of IASCO, started in the 1950s. I told him about the planned meeting. He said, who do those bastards think they are? He said, the Japanese select chief pilot. And he says, Lou, are you going to the meeting? I said, yes, I am. He says, when you go to the meeting, he says, I want you to take the names of those that vote that they want a new chief pilot. I just may deduct a month's salary from them. So he said, when he asked me if I was going, I said, yeah, I have my limousine waiting for me. And I went to the Yokohama Officers Club in uniform, went upstairs in my flight bag, walked in the conference room. There was 14 captains, and their chin dropped to see me. And I said, sorry I'm late, guys, but I had a flight. Now, if somebody bring me up to date on what's going on, I'll pull up a chair. They didn't say anything. Randy Hayes, I figured, was chairing the meeting. I said, Randy, bring me up to date. He says, well, Lou, he says, we voted for a new chief pilot. We had 12 voting yes, 1 abstained, and 1 voted no. But I said, Randy, you never counted my vote. He says, hell, we know how you vote, Lou. Anyway, I said, well, you ought to know that before I came here, I talked to Captain Jim Jack, and he wants me to take the names of all those that voted for a new chief pilot. He just made deduct a month's salary. So I said, that's all I have to say today. I said, I'm going heading home for a shower and a beer. On July 3rd, 1971, I received a call from the Japanese chief pilot informing me that a YS-11 was missing on a flight up to Hokkaido. He said that the captain was Jack Spence. Remember that name? He was one of the ones that required 12 hours flying, trained in Piedmont. He said the captain was Jack Spence, was one of the pilots. I asked him if anyone had informed Jack's wife, and he said, no, Lou, that's up to you. So my wife, turned out to be my ex-wife, and I jumped in the car and went over to Joyce's house. And when we reached there, we were surprised the house was surrounded with about 12 to 15 reporters banging on doors and windows trying to get inside. I knocked on her door, and she said, go away. I said, Joyce, this is Lou Martin and my wife let us in. She opened the door, and I had to actually push photographers away, trying to get in the house when I went inside. After I got inside, she said, Lou, oh, Lou, I know something has happened to Jack, so tell me what's going on, unquote. I told her that Jack's airplane was reported missing that the company would call me here when they had further information. A short time later, her phone rang, and the Japanese chief pilot told me that they had found the wreckage of the missing YS-11, and all 64 passengers and crew were killed. Following the accident, this is kind of surprising, but again, we were in Japan. Following the accident, all foreign pilots were grounded and instructed to meet with the Japanese inspector, Mr. Matsushima. Remember that name? That's the one who gave me the check ride when I went to sleep. He asked if we had any idea the cause of the accident. Naturally, we did not, but frustrated, he said, quote, "But we had this other accident with an American captain," unquote. I said, "When?" "What other accident are you talking about?" He said, quote, "An aircraft piloted by an American captain hit a mountain on the island of Oshima in 1952, 20 years earlier. Since then, there have been many accidents piloted by Japanese pilots, but nothing was said about those. We were taken off the flight schedule for a week, and before being allowed to return, were required to take an exam on Japanese regulations and procedures. This was kind of humorous. We were also issued Japanese and English dictionaries. They were of no use because it's Japanese to English. In 1973, I was scheduled for a line check administered by Captain Ebahara. He was a World War II Japanese fighter pilot. After taking off in a 500-foot sitting, the right engine fire light came on. I silenced the bell, pulled the power lever back, and the light went out. With all other engine indications normal, I turned to Captain Ebahara and I said that I was not going to shut down the engine, but we returned to Tokyo for a replacement aircraft. 30 minutes later, we were in a different aircraft. The line check to Hokkaido and back was uneventful. Following the flight, I noted that Captain Ebahara was having difficulty completing the check ride form as he had to put most of it in English. Finally, he showed me what he had written and asked me if it was okay. It read, in part, quote, "Captain Martin is one cool customer," unquote. He also rated me high in a column labeled guts. When I reported for a flight, a dispatcher said, "Captain Martin, you are a very famous pilot." I did not understand what he was talking about until he showed me an article. I passed part of the magazine around, and a Japanese aviation magazine, which obtained my picture, a picture of the C-133, and a 3-page article written in Japanese. I asked him if it could be translated into English, and he said it would be ready in a couple of weeks. A paraphrase of that article as it was in my in-basket. There is a foreign pilot named Martin with Japan Domestic Airlines. I frequently fly between Tokyo and Hanamaki, but only 1 out of 5 times I find him as the pilot. Big as he is, I always get an impression that the center of gravity moved forward on his YS-11 aircraft. My business requires me to fly throughout Japan, so I come to remember the name of the pilot when his flying is good. It may be said that controllability of the aircraft depends on the type, but whatever it may be, I would say that nobody can land as good as Captain Martin. His landing is so smooth that you rarely realize when the wheels touch down. A DC-8 of Japan Airlines always lands with a thump and a big shock. Sometimes the shock causes the oxygen mask to fall out. The Boeing 727s and 737s generally make a smooth landing, and yet nobody can match with Captain Martin's skill in landing. Then, what about the other YS-11s flown by different pilots? Most of their landings give a big shock, and sometimes the wheels rebound after touchdown. The purpose of riding an airplane is to get to its destination as quickly as possible. Most of the time, I feel comfort when the airplane finally makes a touchdown at destination. My fisted hands generally sweat at takeoff and landing depending on how I feel that day. Nevertheless, I feel no worries when I am on board Captain Martin's plane. I can be pretty much confident that if a man uses such care in making a landing, he must be much discreet during takeoff and cruise. Isn't that something? I have that framed in my hero's wall. In December 1972, I'll get check the clock here. Oh, we're okay. 24 minutes. Right, Glenn? In December 1972, our 2-year contracts were up for renewal, and I was requesting to form Captain Mn. That was my stick buddy. And Captain Emery, the hard of hearing guy, that their contracts would not be renewed. The remaining 2.5 years with the airline were very enjoyable. I was flying 70 hours a month, had plenty of time off, making good money, and riding my landlord's motorcycles throughout Japan. But some problems were still being brought to my attention. In late 1974, I want you to listen to this. In late 1974, the Japanese Ministry for Transport publicly advised JDA to hire no more foreign pilots. Here's an article, again a paraphrase of an article, that appeared in the Japanese Times, English edition. The Japanese Ministry of Transport publicly advised Japan Domestic Airlines to hire fewer foreign pilots. Foreign pilots are not equipped to master the complicated knowledge of flying Japan, since many airports are located near high mountain ranges where air turbulence can be expected, thunderstorms and lightning are often encountered, and light aircraft increase the possibility of collisions. To serve local routes, a pilot needs a very detailed knowledge of the local geography. And when a foreign captain mans a cockpit, it is necessary that the company chooses as his colleague a Japanese co-pilot or instructor pilot who is fluent in English. The company should spend less money on publicity and more on safety, and to work closely with their bigger airline brothers, Japan Airlines and all Nippon Airlines. That was actually in the paper. My last flight for JDA, "26 minutes and counting." My last flight for JDA was in March 1975. I was quite disappointed. I flew the first flight with JDA, and I flew the last flight, and they treated me just as a normal flight. Nobody said anything. I just turned in my paperwork and left. I think they were glad the whole turmoil was over. Here's a sidebar note. I got along real well with the president of IASCO, and when I was leaving, he was hoping to transfer me to a Boeing 727 or a DC-8 in JAL. He actually spoke to the JAL president. The JAL president said he can't do that, because I came from an airline that had a guy that was hard of hearing, one crashed in the mountain, an alcoholic, and it would be an insult to the Japanese if they transferred me to JAL. So my next flying job would be in Iran, which someday may be another story, but don't count on it. I'm often asked how I get along with my Japanese wife. Just ask me that. My answer is, in the morning I say, "Yes, dear." At lunchtime I say, "Yes, dear." At dinner time I say, "Yes, dear." And before I'm going to bed I say, "Yes, dear." Everything works out well. We have time for 2 questions, then I'll stay around if anybody wants to ask any more. If anybody has any questions, I got 2 more minutes for my 30. And where's Bob? Bob, wake up, Bob. I'm almost over.
Are you done?
No, 2 more minutes.
Boy, did you only give him a half hour?
Yeah, I got 2 more minutes, Bob. Any questions?
Take 5, you're doing good.
Take 5. Yes.
Were you proficient in the Japanese language when you were selected?
That's a good question. Not really. See, one of the spin-offs of hiring foreign pilots was that they could practice their English to a native-born speaker. And every time I tried to speak Japanese, they would revert to English. So I didn't learn much Japanese. I learned a few phrases. I mentioned, Vince gave me 5 minutes. I mentioned that the American pilots were insulting the limousine drivers. I want to tell you what I told the driver, my American colleagues at a meeting. I said, you idiots, I said, if you have a 6:30 in the morning pickup, the limousine driver will arrive about 6:15. He looks at his watch, and then he's got about 15 minutes to go, so he takes off his driving gloves, opens the trunk, puts on his working gloves, and he starts polishing the limousine. He keeps checking his watch. At about 6:28, he puts on his driving gloves, opens the rear door, starts the air conditioning or the heater, depending on the season, stands there with the Japan Times waiting for you to roll out at 6:30. I said, you idiots, if you're ready at 6:15, you walk out, you screwed up his whole day. You're insulting his ancestors. And I said, I stand by the window and wait when he's by the back door. That's when I got it. Another thing you're doing is the Japanese, they like heated cabins. I said, in the limousine, this is where my little Japanese comes out. If the limousine is too hot, you reach up and slap them on the shoulder and you say, Arane, Taksui. And I said, you tell them, Atsui, it's too hot. They said, well, what the hell do you do, Lou? I said, if it's too warm, I position myself in the rear view mirror so he can see me. I loosen my tie a little bit. If that doesn't get his attention, I just crack the window. And he determines that I'm too warm. And he turns the temperature down, then I roll up the window and loosen my tie. I said, this is the way you have to deal with the Japanese. Spook had a question.
Yeah, have you ever had psychological testing to determine whether you had any kamikaze tendencies?
Well, Spook, I didn't fly with any kamikaze pilots that had a successful mission. But I did some of the Japanese pilots that I flew with. I mentioned Captain Ebahara, World War II fighter pilots. And some of the Japanese captains that gave me check rides, the co-pilots the next day would say, Captain, you get check ride with Tanaka-san. I say, yes. They said, you know Tanaka-san bombed Pearl Harbor. So I flew with a few that had bombed Pearl Harbor, and some that were kamikaze squadron pilots but never sorted. Otherwise, I wouldn't have flown with them. Any other questions?
Tell them about when you call a tower, wherever you are in the world.
Well, everything in the English language is the international language. So the remote airports, their English was not too good, but they still spoke English. One time I landed in Tokyo where their English was very good, and they gave me taxi instructions, and I was going down a taxiway, and there was a 747 coming right at me. And the tower operator reverted to Japanese because he got so excited. And I turned to my co-pilot and I said, what the hell is he talking about? He says, he don't want you to hit the 747. I said, well, you tell him he doesn't have to worry, I'm not going to hit the 747. I said, we have enough room to turn around. And the co-pilot told him that in Japanese. After I made a 180 taxi, then we went back to English. So it was interesting. Any other questions?
Did you always fly the same model airplanes up there?
When the 4.5 years that I was in Japan, I always flew the YS-11. It was a good airplane. It was with the engines on a hot temperature day, like in August. There was a crossing point that required 13,000 feet on departure, and sometimes with 64 passengers on a hot August day, we'd have to make a couple circles to hit that 13,000 feet before we could cross. But it was good. I mentioned, I got 2 more minutes on Vince's extension. I mentioned that after that accident when Jack Spence hit a mountain, we were grounded, and there's other Japanese accidents. I can remember just a few out of my head. A DCA crashed in Moscow. When the co-pilot, the captain said gear up, he extended the spoilers. Went right in and crashed, everybody killed. A DCA crashed in New Delhi, everybody killed. A DCA crashed in Bombay when the captain made it, he mistook a small airport, a 4,000-foot strip, and landed and ran off the end of the runway. A few were killed. There was a DC-8, as you recall, that made a ditching and going into San Francisco. There was 2 DC-8s that skid off the runway, wet runway in Okinawa, Korea. All these accidents happened but they were Japanese, not foreigners. One reason that we were looked at more closely, and this question has been asked, JAL had been hiring foreign captains for years, but they were flying international. The Japanese pilots and the flight attendants were more attuned to American style of doing things. JDA, this is the first time they'd hired American foreign pilots. And like I mentioned, the Japanese Pilots Union were against hiring us. They didn't hire additional groups. And initially we were told even that we may go to DC-9s ourselves, but that never materialized. By the time I finished that job, in today's standards, I was making almost $200,000 a year. They made the uniforms a little large so we'd have room for our wallets. That's why this one still fits me today. Well, one more question.
How big of a pack of yen was 200,000?
We were paid in US dollars through our ASCO. And we even paid Social Security because we were paid to an American company. And they're acting as our agent. This pissed off several of our American colleagues, because all during our contract, they collected 15% of our salary. But when we'd have meetings, I'd tell you guys, quit your goddamn bitching. You're making good money. Even if they took 20%, they got us the job, so it's to quit it. They didn't like me as chief pilot because I was too direct and I was in the middle between the Japanese and the Americans. But they never succeeded in getting rid of me. Afterwards, they started to accept me a little bit more because I went to the company and I asked the company if I could interview all the foreign captains, and every month in their newsletter, print an article about them and their family with pictures. I went to every house of the foreign captains, took their picture, wrote an article, and every month was a new article about a foreign captain. The Japanese loved it, and the American captains started to accept me. They didn't like me, but they started to accept nothing they could do about it. I was their chief pilot. Okay, thank you very much.